Now, from Sherlock Holmes to Philip Marlowe, Miss Marple to Kurt Wallander, we have an enduring fascination with the crime novel. So just what is it that we love so much about crime fiction? With me in studio, somebody who knows better than most, best-selling crime writer John Connolly. John, thank you for coming in.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, I suspect that you perhaps came to the pleasures of crime reading, or reading crime fiction, I should say, a lot earlier than you started writing it. So when did you first fall in love with crime?
I fell in love simultaneously with my father. My father would pick one book a year to read when we went on holidays. He was a reader of newspapers, and one year he accidentally picked up I, Claudius by Robert Graves, which was a terrible error, and took him 2 years to read. And the next year he picked up Let's Hear It for the Deaf Man by Ed McBain, because it was a much shorter book. And I think I fell in love with the title. And it was the only book my father and I read simultaneously that we fought over. But he never read another one, whereas it was like a light had dawned on me, and I thought, this is fantastic stuff. Give me more of this, please.
And it went from there? I mean, did you set about devouring as much crime fiction as you could?
I did. I think one of the reasons why, when I was thinking about why we love it so much, people who don't understand crime fiction often say it's plot-driven. No, crime fiction is it's all about plot. All good fiction is about character, and crime fiction more than most. Because if you ask somebody what was the plot of the crime novel you read last week, they won't be able to tell you. They all blend into one another. Somebody died, the butler did it, whatever happened. What they remember is the character. And I fell in love with the characters from the 87 Precinct, and it taught me something, which is that Ed McBain wrote 87 Precinct novels for 50 years of his life. So if you were a fan for over half a century, you could read about these characters once or twice a year, and you couldn't but develop an affection for them. And that's why readers return to crime fiction, and it can be devil writers. For Sherlock Holmes, if you think about Arthur Conan Doyle very famously killing off Sherlock Holmes because Conan Doyle thought that he was going to be a writer of great historical fiction and was going to receive great literary plaudits, and his public didn't want to read his historical novels. They had no affection for Arthur Conan Doyle. They had a lot of affection for Sherlock Holmes, and he was forced to bring it back. So it's all about character.
And as if to bolster your argument, not that it needs bolstering, but Declan has texted in to say, I do some garden work for a friend of John Connolly's mum. They play bridge together. John's mum gave a gift of a plant to this lady, and we had to call the plant Charlie Parker. So now in Dublin, there's a lovely hydrangea named after my favourite detective. P.S. When's his next book
Good
out?
Lord, you forget how small the city is sometimes, don't you? Good grief.
And you have a book coming in April, I think, to answer the question. Yes. It's called A Song of Shadows on the 9th of April.
That's correct.
Actually, I think we're in a position to hear some, maybe the definitive detective, Philip Marlowe.
So you're a private detective? I didn't know they existed except in books, or else they were greasy little men snooping around hotel corridors. Ah, you're a mess, aren't you?
I'm not very tall either. Next time I'll come on stilts, wear a white tie, and carry a tennis racket.
I doubt if even that would help. Now, this business of Dad's, think you can handle it for him?
It shouldn't be too tough.
Really? I would have thought a case like that took a little effort.
Not too much.
What will your first step be?
The usual one.
I didn't know there was a usual one.
Oh, sure there is. It comes complete with diagrams on page 47 of how to be a detective in 10 easy lessons, correspondence school textbook, and your father offered me a drink.
You must have read another one on how to be a comedian.
Hear what I said about the drink?
I'm quite serious, Mr. Marlowe. My father's
said your
not.
father.
Help yourself.
And that's Raymond Chandler's definitive detective character, Philip Marlowe, played there in the film version of The Big Sleep by Humphrey Bogart. Lauren Bacall is the other voice, of course, playing Vivian Rutledge, and it's the scene where Marlowe meets Vivian Rutledge for the first time.
But that's a great example of what I was talking about, in that the Big Sleep is an unintelligible novel. It was a kind of Frankenstein's monster of a book made up of bits of old stories that Chandler had. And very famously, when they were filming the Big Sleep, they called Chandler one evening and said, he said, how's the film going? So they said, very good, very good. Just had one question, who killed the chauffeur? And Chandler said, I've no idea. And they said, but there's a dead chauffeur in the book. And he said, I know, I killed the chauffeur. And I meant to go back and sort that out, but I never quite got around to it. All our affection for The Big Sleep is really tied up with Humphrey Bogart and that character of Marlowe and that interaction. The plot of The Big Sleep, completely inconsequential and can't be understood anyway. So it is all about character. And even if you think about TV, in the 70s, we all probably sat down and watched, Columbo or The Rockford Files or Hawaii Five-0, and they were exactly the same every week. You knew that Columbo at the very end of the series would go, just one more thing, and then, he'd solve the crime. You watched it for the pleasure of spending time with this funny little man in an overcoat, and that's why when people go into bookstores, they will ask, do you have the new Jack Reacher book? Do you have the new Kay Scarpetta book? They don't really care if it, and when these authors die, the author Robert B. Parker died a couple of years ago, and I love loved his books, the Spencer novels. There are still Robert B. Parker Spencer novels being published every year. Nobody cares that it's somebody else's name in small print at the bottom. They just want to spend time with Spencer.
And so you say its character is what appeals to us most. Clearly, you're firmly of that view. But is it that we like to have crime solved as well?
I mean, the affection is character, but there are two reasons we read it. One is that when you're getting on a plane to Malaga, you don't always want to be carrying Middlemarch. Not that there's anything wrong with Middlemarch, but there are sometimes that we just want to be entertained. And the least we can ask from a book is that it entertains us for the duration that we're reading it. But the second reason is that in real life, people get away with terrible crimes. In real life, justice isn't done. The writer William Gaddis used to say, in the next world we have justice, in this world we have the law. You know, it's very interesting. We've all been following, obviously, the Ian Bailey libel case in the court at the moment. And there's a man trying to who feels his reputation has been assailed. Increasingly, it looks less and less like whoever killed Sophie Toscan-du-Plantier is ever going to stand trial for it. That wouldn't be a satisfactory novel. A novelist wouldn't write that. In the end, a novelist would give you a sense of justice. And even the darkest of the books, even if you're reading people like James Ellroy, who has a fairly bleak view of the world, at the end, as Edmund Burke used to say, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to stand by and do nothing. In mystery fiction, good men and good women make a stand, because not to make a stand is to become complicit in what happens.
By definition, crime is not very nice in real life, and I suppose it can't be in fiction. But do you ask yourself much or frequently, John, just how much grisly can people take? I remember I think it might have been the second of your novels, and the name escapes me. There was an awful lot of stuff about people being flensed.
That was the first one, yes. Actually, you didn't even get onto the second one.
But no, I think I did. But it's and Charlie Parker says it, but I just found, oh my God, I'm not going to sleep well after this. Well, actually,
most crime, if you look at the crime that we deal with in the papers, is mundane and dull and nasty and brutish and unpleasant. It's frequently, when women die in real life, it's frequently as the result of a domestic interaction. It's that they frequently die at the hands of men that they know. They don't die at the hands of bizarre serial killers who want to make them into hats. That we tend to make it actually much more, I don't want to use the word glamorous, but slightly more interesting than it is in real life. But the flip side of that is that when Michael Gallagher, the man who used to own Murder Inc. in Dawson Street, the lovely mystery bookstore, when I used to go in there, he would have inside the door a shelf of non-fiction crime books, almost exclusively dealing with really violent, often sexual crimes, very explicit. And I said to him, who buys these books? And he said, women buy these books. Men never buy these books. And I think it's a way of exploring, as all crime fiction is, as all dark fiction is, it is a way of exploring in a safe environment the things that we don't want to have happen to us, the things that frighten us deeply about our existence. And the darker mystery fiction lets you do that to some degree.
And is there an increasing appetite then for the explicitly violent crime fiction?
I think there is sometimes a race to the bottom in that writers wonder, how do you shock readers? We have seen so much, we have read so much. It's not an exact science. There are writers who will say, look, I have a duty to portray the world as it really is. I don't buy that. I think most of us want to set the pulse racing a little bit, and we will occasionally overstep the mark. The issue really is misogyny. That's the one it comes down to. Quite frequently in crime novels, women are victims. And like I said, in reality, women are victims in very unpleasant, nasty domestic situations. And we put women in crime novels, I think, because you get a different emotional response from the reader. If you kill a man in a crime novel, we kind of are inured to the killing of men. Young men die. That's what happens to them. But if you put a woman in a crime novel as a victim, you get a whole different set of resonances and responses from the reader. And that way lies misogyny. And that way lies a very casual way of drawing the reader in through violence. And most writers, and I would be one of them, would be very conscious of not doing that.
But do you think, for instance, women writers, you talked about women readers a minute ago, but women writers are every bit as capable of putting in the dark stuff, the grisly stuff, as male writers?
Women write more violent books than men. I think women are much more comfortable with writing about violence to the body than men are. If you look at the forensic school of writing, which is the idea of exploring a crime through the medium of the human body, that was invented by female writers. That was invented by Patricia Cornwell and taken up by people like Kathy Reichs and Kathy Fox. Those are the people who write that. Men generally tend to shy away from that kind of writing. And I also think that men are perhaps more aware of being open to accusations of misogyny than women are, and would then be careful. I think most men are careful about not treading into that territory.
Do you often engage, or frequently have to engage, with your editors and your publishers about maybe toning it down a bit?
No, from my own work, as I've got older, I think I've become more gentle. I think I've realised that less is more. So no, that isn't really an issue for me. And it's not, for me, it's not about shocking the reader, and it's about drawing them in. And I find that one moment, you don't even have to be explicit. The reader's imagination will do most of the work for you if you let them. So you get better at it as you go along. If I could go back and rewrite that first one to make it gentler for you, Seán, I would.
Well, look, I think I'm gonna brace myself. One of the nice things about this job is I get to read a lot more than I used to, on the basis of need. So we will have another go at, and we look forward to seeing our reading A Song of Shadows in April. But in the meantime, what about our own history in this country of crime fiction? There's maybe a less crime set here. You, for instance, you set your own work in the United States along the East Coast.
When I started, there wasn't much of it. There have been writers through the years who have tried to do it, some relatively recently. Gene
Kerrigan would spring to mind.
Well, Gene Kerrigan is certainly part of that new breed, but for a long time, certainly when there was a lot of crime fiction being written in England and America in the 70s and 80s, when it seemed to be a kind of explosion in crime writing, that didn't happen here. And I think in part that it may be because we were a rural society where it wasn't terribly violent, crimes were solved quite quickly, but also we had the elephant in the room was terrorism. It is very hard to write a kind of domestic mystery when 2 hours up the road from Dublin people are killing themselves in a kind of social religious class war. And also because so much crime in Ireland tied into terrorism. If you think about terrorists importing pornography, running prostitutes, taking cuts off drug deals, whatever it may be, in order to fund their activities. If you wanted to write a crime novel and have, say, the chief of staff of some paramilitary organisation in Ballymena as one of the characters in it, there was probably a real chief of staff in Ballymena, and he didn't want to be in your book, thanks very much. So it was very hard to write the kind of crime fiction that was being written in Europe in Ireland, simply because we had this situation where the crime we were dealing with was terrorist crime. And that's very hard to write about while it's ongoing. And you can see that as much in Irish literary fiction as crime fiction.
And maybe the period you're talking about, the reality was that the truth was as strange as fiction in many instances.
Absolutely. And still, we still have it. What's interesting in Ireland is that we've always had a fascination with reading non-crime books about Ireland. We don't want to read gangland fiction, but we are fascinated by these guys. So
tell me about Charlie Parker at this stage. How do you feel about him? Apart from the fact that he puts a lot of bread and butter on your table.
It pays the mortgage. The kids love him. I never thought that 16 years on, I would still be writing these books.
How many books at this stage?
It'll be, I think it's about 14 of the Parker books, 13 or 14 now, as well as other things. I didn't think I would still write it. And it goes back to the question that you asked originally, why do people read it? It's because somehow people have affection for this character and the characters around him, and that's why they come back to them. And ultimately they want to see these characters win. They want to see them triumph.
And does he mature with age? Does he get wiser?
So I'm not sure about him. I think so. One of the issues in crime fiction with characters has always been, do you let them age? James Lee Burke is a very good example. I think James Lee Burke is the greatest living crime writer. His character, Dave Robichaud, is now into his 60s. So they are very different books from the books Burke was writing when Robichaud was in his 40s. You can't kick doors down, you can't get into fights with people. The nature of the books changes if you let the character grow older. So yeah, they have changed, and they will continue to change.
How many more years has he left in him then? What age is he now at this stage?
He's about 2 years older than I am, so he's in his late 40s. I've always kind of kept him more or less aging. I'm not sure. The really curious thing is that most writers don't get to outlive their characters. Most writers die. And because people get really annoyed if you kill off your characters. If I die tomorrow, if I step out of here and get run over by a car, people will say, God, he sounded so full of life on the radio with Seán O'Rourke. It just tells us about, how transient life is. If I were to kill off my character, I would be getting letters in the mail. I'd be getting stuff written in green biro. So I've realised, I've come to terms with the fact that they don't like me as much as they like a character who's completely invented.
Well, he will endure, there's no doubt about that.
Well, it would be nice to think so.
Viv says by text, my father loved the library, and besides, in the 1950s we couldn't afford to buy books, so he would plead with the librarians in Capel Street, Pearse Street and Drumcondra. They're all in Dublin, obviously, and I'm sure the same would apply to libraries around the country as well, to put by any Ed McBain 57 precinct books for us. Also Carter Dixon and John Dixon Carr. I was 11 at the time, says that yes. Listener. And Peter in Wexford. Now this is a pronunciation challenge for me. He says, don't forget to mention Dave Robichaud.
Yeah, Robichaud. That's James Lee Burke.
Okay, and then a few more. A listener wants to know if John Connolly rates Michael Connolly.
Rates Michael Connolly. Yes, I know Michael reasonably well. In fact, when my mother, since she was mentioned earlier, when she went to see him, he spelled his name Connolly just for her. So Michael Connolly is the son my mother never had.
And I suppose there's all sorts of possibilities now of new plants being named, not just hydrangeas in your honour or after.
And
after
new plants being named
Parker.
after a whole lot of Irish crime writers, because we have this. We've seen people like Tana French doing incredibly well. Sinead Crowley, your own Sinead Crowley, doing very well. It seems female writers, and
I
particularly
really enjoyed it. That was a
very good
crime
book.
Yeah.
I think female writers writing psychological crime fiction. I think that's an area where Irish writers seem to be particularly strong at the moment, and that's what I see as part of the future for Irish crime fiction here. I think they will continue to do very, very well.
And people still have, we talked about this to Edel Coffee yesterday, they still have about, I think, maybe 7 hours to fill in those forms for the Arts Council bursaries if they want to get some grants to.
Oh, I heard that
finish
last time. Throwing money around, absolutely. Put your hat in the ring.
Okay, now just before you go, John, do you want to give us any few little hints about what the next book is about, or just a few little
The next
teasers?
book is about, I became very interested in, I was talking to a man named Eli Rosenbaum, who runs the human rights prosecution section in the United States, who are hunting the last of the Nazi war criminals. These very elderly men and women who are going to die in the next couple of years, and the Americans are very anxious to get them off their soil, to either deport them or extradite them. So I became very interested in that. So that's the substance of the next book.
And you've just published a sci-fi book as well that you've co-written with
my better half. Yeah. Called Empire. Yeah, be very careful about collaborating with people who can put glass in your food. That's what I'd say.
And, what was it like just doing a two-hander?
The first one was very, very difficult because I suppose because I'd written so many books alone, and I did pull rank and kind of go, see all those books on the shelf, they weren't just picked up off the ground. I wrote those, but much better for having her involved with it because there was going to be teenage girls at the heart of it, and I don't know a lot about teenage girls, and I have no business knowing anything about them. So she added something extra to it.
Is it a good test of a relationship to work like that as you do with Jennifer from time to time?
It's a ferocious test of a relationship. Yes, and it's taught me much needed skills of diplomacy that after all these years I still had to learn.
Don't really say what you really think all the time, no?
No, absolutely. Sometimes keep your mouth shut and agree and say, yes, that seems like a really good idea.
And sometimes the word fine doesn't actually mean fine.
No, sometimes, yes, absolutely. And yes, I've learned to keep my mouth shut.
Or whatever you think doesn't really mean whatever you think.
Yeah, you're not helping the situation, Seán, but thanks very much.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. John Connolly, thank you so much for coming in.
My pleasure.